Please welcome Steve Reis and Bryan Hancock.
Morning, everyone. I'm Steve Reis.
And good morning, I'm Bryan Hancock. We're very excited to be here today to talk a little bit about our research into the effects of automation and AI on people and communities. So as the McKinsey Global Institute, we've spent the past 4 years looking deeply at the impact of automation and AI on jobs, on individuals, and communities. And one of the things we found is that in total, the amount of jobs that are going to be created through 2030 are going to more than offset the amount of jobs that are going to disappear due to automation. But there are going to be very different impacts depending on where you are and who you are. And so what we wanted to do today is share a little bit of our research on how work is changing and dive a little bit deeper into the context here in Georgia. So at the McKinsey Global Institute, we took all 800 occupations tracked by the US government, and we went down to the task level. So we looked at 2,000 individual tasks that add up into those occupations. And at the tasks level, we asked the question, what is automatable today using existing technologies? Whether it's robotic process automation, natural language processing, or other technologies, what's automatable today? And what we found is that 60% of all the occupations in the US economy have 30% or more of their tasks automatable. So 60% of jobs have 30% or more of the tasks automatable. But does this mean that the robots are coming for our jobs? Not really, because right around 5% of jobs are fully automatable. So this means that work is changing more and jobs are changing more than jobs being wholesale eliminated. But let's talk a little bit about how that looks by different job. So we've looked at all the occupations, and just along the spectrum, just to highlight some of the differences, if you're a sewing machine operator, your job is fully at risk. The robots can do what a sewing machine operator does, be replaced. Similarly, dental lab technicians that process dental x-rays. Right now, digital x-rays can do almost all of that today, so a dental hygienist can do what was done. On the other end, legislators and chief executives, those are purely human tasks, very little of which can be automatable. And to give you one sense of how we looked at this analysis, massage therapists have about 8% of their job automatable. This does not mean that the robot comes in for 8% of your massage and does it. It means that the scheduling function that a massage therapist does in a hospital or owning their own schedules, that can be automated using new technology. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of how we looked at it. And then we look at what are the skill mix going forward. And the way we like to think about it is, if you look over the past 100 years, a lot of work has been getting humans to work like machines in the physical and manual world or in the basic cognitive, like data entry. As the dull and the dangerous work gets automated, what is left is the more uniquely human activities, the social and emotional skills, the higher cognitive or creative or innovative skills, and in particular, of course, technology that's underlying all of this. But as we go forward, that means that our skill mix does need to go more towards those higher cognitive, those social, emotional, and those technological skills. Okay, so we've looked at this from an occupation lens and from a skills that people have lens. But what about where work gets done lens? We looked at all 3,100 counties and 300 cities across the US. And we looked at what is the automation potential of the jobs that represent those communities. We overlapped that with a view of about 30 or so variables that helped indicate the resiliency of the communities. What kind of trajectory are they on? What are their underlying industry base, their industry mix, the higher education? We had 13 different segments, and what we recognized is that the challenge of matching people to the new work can be very different across these 13 archetypes. Just like the world of work isn't changing uniformly for all occupations, it's not changing uniformly for all communities. In some communities, like Atlanta or Washington, D.C., what we would call our mega cities, there's lots of economic growth. So the challenge is making sure that we're inclusive, or one of the challenges is making sure that we're inclusive in matching people to those opportunities. In some other segments, like the urban periphery, so in Atlanta area, this might be Henry County, it's really about connecting people in that location as distribution centers or other employment centers there get automated. Again, there may be still net opportunity in the Atlanta metro area broadly, but how are we connecting people in Henry County, both from a skill perspective and from a physical perspective there? So we've looked at this across 13 different segments. Some of the more distressed segments, as you look down the chart, have a higher bar on job creation. How are we going to create the new opportunities as work gets automated in those communities and the new jobs appear elsewhere? That's another one of our findings here, is where the new jobs are going to be increasingly concentrated. So 60% of the new jobs created between now and 2030 will occur in only 25 cities. 60% of the new jobs will occur in only 25 cities. And here's the list of the cities. Atlanta's on the list, along with places like New York, Seattle, Washington, San Francisco. And one of the questions that when we look at this, and going back to this map, is, hey, in those cities that are growing, how do we make sure that we're creating people to opportunity or matching people to opportunity in those cities? But how do we also think about the other cities and the other communities and creating opportunities and matching people to opportunities there? So I'll hand it over to Steve to talk a little bit more in detail about what we're seeing in Georgia.
Thanks, Bryan. So we thought we'd bring to life what Bryan just described using Georgia and the metro Atlanta area as an example. And so here's a similar map to what Bryan showed imposed on Georgia on the left-hand side. And what you see based on the color coding is, as we project out to 2030, what do you expect, or what would we expect the job growth to be in each county within Georgia? And it's quite a stark map, because every place in orange on current trend and trajectory and what's going on with technology will lose jobs through 2030. But there will be a double-digit increase in Atlanta, and as you can see on the slide, on order of 14%. Now, as Bryan talked about, this concept of urban centers, in our research, we often call them superstar cities. This is a global phenomenon, particularly in the developed world, where if we were to show you a chart of what's happening in economic growth everywhere, with major cities versus the rest of the world, it's going like this, and will continue to diverge. And because more and more work and economic activity is based on information and technology that has a network effect, that's not going to change. So the question is, how do you link into that and help the rest of the geographic areas take advantage and draft off of that growth? And at the same point in time, support more independent economies, areas like Augusta, which you see on the chart, have a healthy cybersecurity and kind of government spending growth that's driving their economy, or a place like Athens, which is a classic college town and can sustain its own economy. So that's kind of the macro story on Georgia. And Atlanta, I think everyone knows, is the economic engine of the state. It's interesting, it's 50% of the population, 2/3 of Georgia's GDP, and it's accounted for 80% of Georgia's GDP growth over the last 5 years. And so this shows that will actually accelerate. However, even within Atlanta, and this is true of any micro or geography you look at, there's disparity. And so you see the counties that make up the metro area and our projection of what's going to happen with job growth. And there's a disconnect. The core of the city where most businesses are headquartered. By the way, if we layered on top of this a map that just said current employment and unemployment, the top part that's blue would be bright green, below national average, and the stuff that's more orange would be in the teens and well above national average unemployment. And so the question is, how do you address that, given all the changes that are happening? The other piece is we took this look at tasks and occupations and applied it to jobs that exist within the city of Atlanta. And so this shows some of the top occupations where we would expect jobs to go away by 2030. So on this page alone, you see about 180,000 jobs in the metro area that we would expect to be displaced by 2030. And on the right-hand side, you see the rate of that displacement over the whole population. And so as Bryan was alluding to, there are very few jobs that go away 100%, but when you can knock out a third, 40% of a certain type of job, you start consolidating roles and lead to this type of impact. Now, this matters a lot if you take into account the broader context of who's in these roles and the concept of the last panel about equity and economic inclusion. If you have a high school degree or less, you are 4 times more likely to have a job or an occupation that has a high displacement rate. This also disproportionately affects the non-white population. So Hispanics are the most likely to have their job displaced because they're so disproportionately represented in food service related occupations that are highly automatable. And the African American population is disproportionately represented in production and manufacturing jobs and occupations, which also have a high displacement rate. And so when we look across the United States, on current course and speed, we would expect about 12 million jobs in the US occupied by members of those 2 communities to go away by 2030, which is quite a stark number. So the question then is, what do we do about this? And as Bryan alluded to, it's really a question of supply and demand and how to make those match more effectively. And so from a supply standpoint, helping the working population be ready for the jobs of the future and be able to match and transition more seamlessly to what the opportunities look like. And then from a demand standpoint, as employers thinking about what the workforce is going to look like, and public stakeholders, public policy writers, thinking through how do you spur economic development that's sustainable as technology evolves. And it's interesting when you dig into the data, going back to Atlanta as an example, it's not a jobs problem, even within Atlanta. The metro area has over 100,000 open positions, and there are over 100,000 people out of the workforce. It's a skills and matching issue. And so one example we like to point to say, okay, well, what does that practically mean, would be to look to Washington, D.C., to an organization called the Greater Washington Partnership. This was a group that got together with the 11 leading universities in the area and the major private sector employers under trying to solve the problem of we just don't have enough technology workers and people that are literate in the types of skills we need going forward to sustain economic growth. And so they launched an effort to say, okay, if we all get on the same page and define what are the skills that we need going forward, let's actually have a description and a definition, and what does it mean to be competent in those skills. And so they agreed to that. Then each of the universities was able to develop a program where students can get a certificate that says that they are proficient in particular skills that goes along with their degree. And then the employers committed to interviewing these students when they applied to jobs that linked with the certification. And so it's a nice example of the private and public sector trying to bridge that supply and demand disconnect and make the matching easier. So I see we have about 30 seconds left. So I'll finish on this page. We're very passionate about this topic. There's a website at the bottom. We have a very long report that has all the charts you guys saw and more, if anyone wants to look it up and leaf through it. And we have our email addresses. Happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here.